Hi, G.I. Joe fans. Merry Christmas. I hope you all had a very happy Thanksgiving. Unfortunately, I did not. I was at work, and while at work, I was injured by moving a patient. So please bear with me. I'm in a little bit of pain. But we're going to be reading from, as promised, Charles Dickens' classic, A Christmas Carol. This is a long book. It's 99 pages, so I will be doing it in two parts, maybe three if need be. So this is part one. Oh, here we go. Some nice illustrations. So there's another illustration of Scrooge. That one's pretty cool. The preface. I've endeavored in this ghostly little book to rise, or the rise of the ghost idea, that in which shall put my readers out of humor, in which themselves with each other, with the reason or me, may it haunt the houses pleasantly, and no one wish to lay it. Their faithful friend and servant C.D. That was in December of 1843. So here we go. Sit back, and I really hope that you enjoy this, reading it in my 18th century clothing. It reads, Marley was dead to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman in the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it. Now please bear with me, I have dyslexia. Scrooge's name was good. Change for anything he chose to put his hand so. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Mind, it was meant to say that, or my mind knowledge, whether is particularly dead as a doornail, it might have inclined myself. I regard a coffin nail as the deadest piece of ironmongery in the trade. Mind the wisdom of our ancestors in this simile, and unhallowed hands shall not disturb it, or the country's done for. You will therefore permit me to repeat empathetically that Marley was dead as a doornail. Scrooge knew he was dead, of course he did. Now it could be otherwise. Scrooge and he were partners, or for I did not know how many years. Scrooge was his sole executor, the sole administrator, his sole assigned, his sole residentary legitimity, his sole friend and sole mourner. But in the excellent man of business, in the very day of the funeral, in the solest and his undoubted bargain, the mention of Marley's funeral brings he back in the point I started. There is no doubt that Marley was dead. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful could come from this story I am going to relate. If I were not perfectly convinced that Hamlet's father died, therefore the play began, where would nothing more remarkable in his taking the role at night in the early wind upon the ramparts there would be any other middle-aged gentleman rashly turning out after dark in a breezy spot, say St. Paul's churchyard, for instance, literally to astonishing his son's weak mind. Scrooge never painted out old Marley's name. There it stood, years towards above the warehouse door. Scrooge and Marley. The firm was known as Scrooge and Marley. Sometimes people knew to the business called Scrooge, and others Marley. He answered to both names. It was all the same to him. Oh, but was the tight-fisted hand at that grindstone? Scrooge! A wheezing, wretched, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner he was, hard and sharp as flint. From now on, so no steel had ever struck out generous fire, secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster. Cold within him, froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his lips blue, spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. Frosty time was on his hand and on his elbows and in his wiry chin. He carried his low temperature always about him. He iced his office in the dog days and didn't thaw it at 1 degree at Christmas. External heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm, no wintry weather chill, no wind blew was bitter than he, no falling snow was more intent upon the purpose, no pelting rain less open entreatly. Foul weather didn't know where to have him. Heavy rain, snow, hail, and sleet boast of heavy over him only in on respect. They often came down handsomely, and Scrooge never did. Nobody ever stopped him in the street to say hi with gladsome cheer. My dear Mr. Scrooge, how are you? When will you come to me? No beggars implored to him to bestow a trifle. No children asked him what was o'clock. No man or woman ever once all in his life inquired which way to come in such a place. Of Scrooge. Ever the blind man's dogs appeared to know him. When they saw him come, they tugged their masters in the doorways up the courts and wagged their tails as though they said, no eye at all is better than the evil eye of dark master. But what did Scrooge care? What was the kind thing he liked? To his way he crawled paths of lives, warning all human sympathy at his distance and knowing ones called nuts to Scrooge. Once upon a time, all the good days in the year, on Christmas Eve, old Scrooge was busy in his counting house. It was cold and bleak, bitter, biting weather, foggy withal. He could hear the people in the court go wheezing up and down, beating their hands on their breasts, stamping their feet upon the pavement stones to keep warm. The city clocks had only gone 3. It was quite dark already. It had been light all day. The candles were flaring in the windows, brightening the offices like ruddy smears upon the palpable down air. The fog came pouring and roaring. Every chink and keyhole was so dense without. And although the court was the narrowest and the houses opposite were more phantoms to see, dingy cloud and drooping downward, obscuring everything. One might come by the nature, live by every day, and was brewing on a large scale. The door of Scrooge's counting house was open, but he might keep the eyes upon his clerk, who was dismal in his dismal little cell beyond the short of the tank, was copying letters. Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clerk was so very much smaller than it looked like on one coal. He could replenish it, for Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room. So surely as the clerk came in to shovel, the master predicted that it would be necessary for him to part. Therefore the clerk was on his white comforter tied around him at a candle in which no effort, not being a man of strong imagination, he failed. "Merry Christmas, Uncle! God save you!" cried a cheerful voice. It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew, who came upon him so quickly. He was the first imitation he had of his approach. "Bah, humbug!" yelled Scrooge. Yelled Scrooge. He was so heated himself with rapid walking in the fog and frost, this nephew of Scrooge's, that he was all glow. His face was ruddy and handsome, his eyes sparkled, and his breech smoked again. "Christmas a humbug, Uncle?" said Scrooge's nephew. "You don't mean that, I'm sure." "I do," said Scrooge. "Merry Christmas. You might be merry. Why have you be merry? You're poor enough." "Come, then," returned the nephew gaily. "What might you have be so dismal? You are rich enough." You're rich enough?" Scrooge had a better answer ready to spur on the moment, and he said, "Bah," again, and followed it up with "humbug." "Don't be cross, Uncle," said the nephew. "What else can I be?" returned the uncle. "When I live in such a world of fools as this, Merry Christmas. Out upon Merry Christmas. What's Christmas to you but a time of paying bills without money, a time of finding yourself a year older, not a year richer, a time of balancing your books and having every item in them round a dozen of months presenting before you? If I could work with you, Mr. Scrooge, imagine instantly, every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips shall be boiled in his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly in his heart." He shouted. "Uncle," pleaded the nephew. Nephew returned to the uncle uncertainly. "Keep Christmas in your own way, and I'll keep it in mine." "Keep it!" repeated Scrooge's nephew. "You don't keep it." Leave it alone, then," said Scrooge. "Much good day to you. Much good has it ever done you. Then there are many things which I might have derived good, by which I have not profited. I dare you," returned my nephew, "Christmas amongst the rest. But I am sure I've always thought of Christmas time when it comes around, apart from venture due to the sacred name and origin and every belonging to it, it can be part of as a good time, a time of forgiving, charity, peace, pleasant time, only when I come of it and belong a calendar year, when men and women come one by consent upon their shut up hearts freely to thank people below them and think their fellow passengers to the grave, and not another race of creatures bound on their journeys. Therefore, Uncle, thought is never but a scrap of gold and silver in my pocket. I believe it has done me good, and I will be me good, I say. God bless it. The clerk in the office involuntarily applauded, becoming immediately sensible and impropriety. He poked the fire and extinguished the last spark of the small coal forever. Let me hear another sound from you, Mr. Scrooge, and you will keep your Christmas by losing your situation. You are quite a powerful speaker, sir, he added, turning to his nephew. I wonder if you don't enter into Parliament. Don't be cross, uncle. Come, dine with us tomorrow, Scrooge said. Dine with us tomorrow. Scrooge said he would see him. Yes, indeed he will. I went to the whole length of expression and said that he will see him in his extremity first. But, nephew, cried Uncle Scrooge, why? Why did you get married? Said Scrooge. Because I fell in love, said the nephew. Because you fell in love, growled Uncle Scrooge. As it were the only thing in the world more ridiculous than Merry Christmas. Good afternoon. Nay, uncle, but you never come to see me before that happened. Why give it a reason for not coming now? Good afternoon, said Scrooge. I want nothing from you. I ask nothing of you. Why can't we be friends? Good afternoon, said Scrooge. I'm sorry, with all my heart. I find you so resolute. Will you never had a quarrel to which I have been a party? But have I the trial of homage of Christmas, and may keep my Christmas honor to the last. So Merry Christmas, Uncle. Good afternoon, said Scrooge. And a Happy New Year. Good afternoon, said Scrooge. Happy nephew left his room without an angry word. Not standing, he stopped at the door to bestow his greetings upon the clerk, who was cold and was warmer than Scrooge, who returned them cordially. There's another fellow, muttered Scrooge, who overwhelmed him. My clerk, fellow, muttered Scrooge, overwhelmed him. My dark within 15 shillings. My clerk, I apologize, with 15 shillings a week, a wife and a family, talking about a Merry Christmas. I'll retire to Bedlam. That was a mental asylum. This lunatic is letting Scrooge's nephew out, let two other people in. They were portly gentlemen, which means they were fat. Pleasant to behold, now stood with their hats off in Scrooge's office. They had books in their hands and papers, and they bowed to him. Scrooge and Marley, I believe, said the gentleman, referring to this list. Have I a pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley? Mr. Marley has been dead these 7 years, Scrooge replied. He died 7 years ago this night. Have you no doubt his liberty is well represented by his surviving partner, said the gentleman, presenting his credentials. I certainly say we had been two kindred spirits at the ominous word liberality. Scrooge frowned and shook his head and handed the credentials back. At this season of the year, Mr. Scrooge, he said the gentleman, taking up part, it is more than usually desirable than make some slight provision for the poor and suffering, who suffer gently at this present time. Many thousands of want are necessary. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common comfort, sir. Are there no prisons? Asked Scrooge. Plenty of prisons, said the gentleman, laying down his pen. Are there no union workhouses? Demanded Scrooge. They are still in operation. Are there still hundreds of gentlemen, I wish to say? Are there not? The treadmill and the poor are still in full vigor, then? Said Scrooge. Both very busy, sir. Oh, well, I was afraid at first that something had occurred to stop their useful course, said Scrooge. I am very glad to hear that. Uncle Scrooge, the impression that was scarcely furnished Christian cheer of mind and body of multitude returned to the gentleman. A few of us are endeavoring to raise fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth, who choose this house as it came of all others. When one and nearly felt apprentice rejoiced, what shall I put you down for? Nothing, Scrooge replied. You wish to be anonymous? I wish to be left alone, said Scrooge. Since you ask me, I wish, gentlemen, that is my answer. I wish to make merry myself at Christmas. I can't afford to make either idle people merry. I help to support the establishments I have mentioned. The cost is enough, and those who are badly off should go there. Many can't go there, and many rather die. Then if they rather die, said Scrooge, they better do it and decrease the surplus population. Besides, excuse me, I know that. But what do you think? Observed the gentleman. It's not my business, Scrooge returned. It's enough for man to understand his own business and not to interfere with another person's. Mine occupies me constantly. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Seeing clearly that it would be business to pursue the point, the gentleman withdrew. Scrooge resumed his labors with an improved opinion of himself, and more factious temper was usually with him. Meanwhile, in the fog of darkness thickened so, the people ran about with flaring links, proffering their services to go before horses and carriage and produce them on their way. Ancient Tower Church, whose gruff old bell was always peeking slightly down, and Scrooge out of the Gothic window in his hall became visible and struck hours and quarters in clouds, tumultuous vibrations toward as his teeth were chattering and it froze. Heads up there, cold became immense in the street. In the corner of the court, the laborers were peering. The gas pipes had lighted great fire in brazier, some which prey of ragged men and boys gathered, warming their hands, winking their eyes before the blaze of rapture. The water plug began being left in solitude. Its flowerings suddenly congealed and turned misanthropic ice. Meanwhile, the shops where holly springs and berries crackled in the lamp's heat and windows, and pale faces ruddy as they passed. Poulterers and grocers' trade became splendid jokes, glorious pageant which is next to impossible to believe that such dull principles as began the scales had many things to do. The Lord Mayor in a strong and mighty mission house gave orders of filthy cooks and butlers to keep Christmas as the Lord Mayor's house began. Even little Taylor, who had fine things of previous Monday before drunk and bloodthirsty in the streets, stirred up tomorrow's pudding in his garret, while his leaning wife and baby sallied out by the beef. Foggier yet and colder, piercing, searching, biting cold. If St. Dunstan had snipped the evil spirit's nose with a touch of weather as that, instead of using his familiar weapons, indeed he would have lusty purpose. The owner of scant young nose gnawed and mumbled by the hungry cold, and bones are gnawed by dogs. Stooped down by Scrooge's keyhole to regale him with Christmas carol. The first sound of God bless ye, merry gentlemen, may nothing dismay. Scrooge seized a ruler with such energy and action that the singers fled in terror, leaving the keyhole by the fog even more congealed frost. At the length of poor shuddering, the main staying house arrived with ill willing. Scrooge mounted his tool and tracked it immediately to the fact of expecting clerk in a tank, who instantly snuffled his candle and put on his hat. You'll want all day tomorrow, I suppose, said Scrooge. If quite convenient, sir. It's never convenient, said Screw. It's not fair. If I were to stop you half a crown, you'd think yourself ill-used. I'll be bound. The clerk smiled faintly, and yet, Scrooge, you think me ill-used if I pay you a day's wages of no work? The clerk observed, it's only once a year. A poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December, Scrooge said, buttoning his green coat over his chin. But I suppose you must have the whole day, but be here earlier the next morning. The clerk promised it would be, and Scrooge walked out with a growl. The office was closed and twinkling in the dark. Long ends of the white comforter dangled about the waist, as if boasting no coat. He went down a side of the cornhill to the end of the lane of boys 20 times in honor of its Christmas Eve. He ran down to Camden Town as hard as he could pelt to lay at Blind Man's Bluff. Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, having read the newspaper, beguiled the rest of the evening, and his banker's book, went home to bed. He lived in a chamber which once belonged to his partner, so Scrooge moved into Marley's house. There were plenty of suite of rooms, lowering a pile of building up a yard. It had so little business to be, and one could scarcely fancy it, but must run where it was young, and playing hide and seek by other houses and forgotten a way out. It was old enough now, dreary enough. Nobody lived in it but Scrooge. The other rooms all let out as offices, so he used the spare rooms he rented out as offices. Yet so dark that even Scrooge knew its every stone, its frame to grope with his hands. The fog, the frost, hung about the black old gateway of the house. It seemed if the genius of the winter sat mournful in meditation on there. Now, in fact, there is nothing all particular about the knocker on the door, except for it was very large. It is also the fact Scrooge had seen it night and morning before the whole residence of his place. Also, Scrooge had a little of his old fancy about any man in the city of London, even including, which in bold word of corporation, aldermen in livery. Let it so be borne to mind that Scrooge had now bestowed one through on Marley, since his last mention of his 7 years, the dead partner that afternoon. Then let many men explain to me, it could be, how it happened that Scrooge, having his key and lock at the door, saw in the knocker, without his undergoing an intermittent process, not a knocker, but Marley's face. Marley's face? It could not. Impracticable shadow of earlier objects in the yard. It had a dismal light about it. It had lobster in the dark cellar. It was angry It was not angry or ferocious, but it looked at Scrooge as Marley would look, its ghostly spectacles turned down its ghostly forehead, it curiously stirred off by a breath of hot air, though the eyes were wide open and perfectly motionless. That it was in livid color, it was horrible, but its horror seemed to be in spite of the face of beyond control rather than a part of its own expression. Scrooge looked fixedly at the phenomenon. It was a knocker again. I say, that's to say that not startled or that his blood was not conscious of the terrible situation, but it had been a stranger from fancy, be unfortunate. But it was a hand upon the key that had relinquished and turned it steadily, walked in, and lit his candle. He paused for a moment irresolute before the door and looked curiously beforehand, as if he saw and expected a terrible and sight, Marley's pigtail sticking out in the hall. It was nothing on the back of the door except screws, nuts that held the door knocker in. And he said, "Pooh, pooh." It was with a bang. The sound rounded through the household like thunder. Every room and every cask, every merchant cellar below appear to have equal peal of echoes of its own. Scrooge was not frightened by the echoes. He fastened the door and walked across the hall up the stairs, slowly trimming his candle as he went. I may walk vigorously about the driving coach. I may talk vaguely about the driving coach upon a good old flight of stairs, as though a boy Act of Parliament, but I mean to say I might have gotten a hearse up that case and taken it down, but the splinter bar below was too tall and the door outwards balustraded and done it, but was plenty of width for that, a room to spare, which in perhaps the reason Scrooge thought he saw a locomotive hearse before him in the gloom. Half-dozen gas lamps out of the street would have lit the entry too. So the walls supposed it was plenty dark, and Scrooge's dip. Scrooge went not carrying a button for that. Darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. Before he shut his heavy door, he walked through his room to see that all was right. He had just enough recollection of the face to do that. The sitting room, bedroom, lumber room, all as they should be. Nobody under the table, nobody under the sofa, a small fire, the great spoon, and the basin ready with a little saucepan of gruel. Scrooge had a cold in his head upon the hob. Under the bed, nobody in the closet, nobody in the dressing room, which hung a suspicious attitude against the wall. The lumber room, as usual. Old fare guarded his shoes, 2 fish baskets, wishing stand, and 3 legs, and a poker. Quite satisfied, he closed the door, locked himself in, double locked it, which was not his custom. So he's pretty scared. Thus, secured against the surprise, he took off his cravat, put on his dressing gown and slippers and nightcap, and sat down before the fire to take his gruel, which is kind of like oatmeal in a way. It was a very low fire indeed, so much so much a bitter night, he was obligated to sit close to it and brood over it. Before he could extract the last sensation of warmth from such a handful of fuel, the fire was an old one, built by the fireplace was an old one, built by some old Dutch merchant long ago, prevailed around the quaint Dutch tiles, desired an illustration of scriptures. Therefore, there were Cain and Abel's, Pharaoh's daughters, queens of Sheba, angelic messengers descended in the clouds like feather beds. Abraham, Belshazzar, I apologize, apostles putting off to the sea of butter boats, hunting hundreds of figures to attract his thoughts, and yet that face of Marley, even 7 years dead, like the ancient prophet's rod, hollowed up to the hole. And each tile he had to blink at first to power the shape of some picture in the surface from the disjointed fragments of the thoughts. He would have been the copy of old Marley's head on each one. Humbug, Scrooge said, and walked across the room. Several turns he sat again and threw his head back in his chair. He glanced and happened to rest upon a bell, a distant bell, hung in the room, a communication for some purpose, now forgotten, but a chamber in the highest story of the building. It was a great astonishment, with a strange, unexpected dread. As he looked, he saw this bell began to ring. It swung so softly in the outlet that it secretly made a sound, but soon it rang louder, and soon did every bell in the house. These were servants' bells from old times. They were all linked down in the kitchen. They'd just pull a string and it would ring the bell in a room. You could see that in Cinderella, the cartoon. They might have lasted a half a time or a minute, but seemed an hour. The bells were ceasing as they begun together. They were succeeded by a clanging noise deep down below, and if some person were dragging a heavy chain over caskets in the wide merchant's cellar, then remembered he had heard ghosts and haunted houses were described as dragging chains. A cellar door flew open in booming sound, and he heard a noise much louder in the doors below, and coming up the stairs, coming straight towards him. "It's humbug still," said Scrooge. "I won't believe it." His color changed, though, and without a pause it came through the door and passed into the room before his eyes. Upon it, the dying flame leaped up through. It cried, "I know him, Marley's ghost." It fell again. The same face, the very same face. Marley in his pigtail, usual waistcoat, tights, boots, tasseled on leather bristling, the pigtail, the coat tails, the hair upon his head, his chin drew was clasped about his middle. It was long and round about his tail. It was as it was made for Scrooge to observe it closely. Cash boxes, keys, chains, ledgers, deeds, heavy purses, rotten steel, his body transparent so Scrooge could observe him, and he looked through his waistcoat and he could see buttons on his coat. Soon after he heard that it was Marley, he said that Marley had no bowels, but never believe it until now. No, nor did he believe it now. He looked at the phantom and the heart through the heart, and it was standing before him, telling him the chilling influence of the death in cold eyes, marked with mixtures of the folded kerchief around his head, and he wrapped it and observed it, and still incredulous fought against the senses. "Oh, now," Scrooge, causing cold to shiver. "What do you want of me?" "Much," Marley's voice said, "no doubt about it." "Who are you?" "Ask who I was." "Who were you then?" Scrooge raised his voice. You are not a particular shade, he was going to say to the shade, but stumbled as more appropriate. In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley. Can you sit down? Asked Scrooge, looking about fully at him. I can. Do it. Scrooge asked the question before he did not know whether a ghost so transparent might find himself in a condition to take a chair. It fell in the event of being impossible. It might involve necessary the embarrassment explanation. The ghost sat down opposite of the fireplace as if he were quite used to it. You don't believe in me, observed the ghost. I do not, said Scrooge. What evidence do I have of my reality of your scene? I do not know. I do not know, said Scrooge. Why do you doubt your senses? Because, Scrooge said, a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheats. You may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. Nothing more than a grave about you. Who are you? Scrooge was not much in the habit of cracking jokes, nor did he feel in his heart that by any means waggish them. The truth that he tried to be smart as the means of distracting of his own attention, keeping down his horror. The spectre's voice disturbed the very of his bones. It sat down with a fixed gaze of silence that a moment would play. Scrooge felt the very deuce in him. There was something so awful, too, in the spectre that belonged, pretended, the infernal atmosphere of his own. Scrooge could not feel himself. It was clearly the case, for the ghost sat perfectly motionless in the chair, skirts and tassels still agitated by a hot spot of vapor from them. Can you see this toothpick? Said Scrooge, and he turned it quickly and charged just to assign the wishing ghost, said not for any second, and diverted his attention to the gaze himself. I do, said the ghost. You're not looking at it, said Scrooge. But I see it, said the ghost, notwithstanding. Well, turned Scrooge, I have to follow this. Be at rest for the days pursuing by a legion of hobgoblins of my own creation. Humbug, I tell you, humbug! As the spirit refrained a fright cry and shook the chains with much dismal appearing noise, Scrooge yelled and held onto his chair to save himself from falling in a swoon. But much greater was his vigor that the phantom took off the bandage from his head that he had worn indoors, and his lower jaw had dropped to his breast. Scrooge fell to his knees, clapped his hands before him. Mercy, he said, dreadful apparition, why do you trouble me? Man of worldly kind, replied the ghost. Do you believe in me or not? It's a picture of Marley and the ghost. I do, said Scrooge. I must. But why do spirits walk to earth? Why do they come to me? It is required of every man, the ghost returned, that the spirit in him should walk among his fellow men and travel far and wide, for the spirit does not go forth in life. It is condemned to go forth in death. It is doomed to wander through the world. Oh, woe is me! And witness it cannot share, but might have shared on the earth and turned to happiness. The spectre cried and shook his chains and wrung his shadowy hands. Why are you fettered? Said Scrooge, trembling. Tell me why. I wear the chain I forged in life, replied the ghost. I made it link by link, yard by yard. I girded it on myself of free will. Of my own free will I wear it. Oh, woe is me! Its pattern its pattern is strange to you? Scrooge trembled more and more. Or would you know the purpose, the ghost? The weight of the chain you coil, you bear yourself? Well, it is heavy, and as long 7 Christmases years ago you have labored upon its sense. It is a ponderous chain. Scrooge glanced about himself on the floor and expected to find himself surrounded by 50 or 60 fathoms of iron cable, but none to be seen. Jacob said imploringly, "Old Jacob Marley, tell me, speak no more to me, Jacob. I have none to give." The ghost replied, "I comes from other regions, Ebenezer Scrooge, to convey to other ministers of other men. Nor can I tell you what I would. A very little more than as all permitted to me. I cannot rest. I cannot stay, cannot linger any more. My spirit never walked beyond our counting house. Mark me. In life, the spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole, and weary journeys lie before me." It was a habit with Scrooge never to become thoughtful, but to put his hand on his breeches pockets, pondering what the ghost had said. Did you know, without lifting his eyes or getting off his knees, you must have been very slow about it, Jacob. Scrooge observed in a businesslike manner the thought of humanity and difference. "Slow," the ghost replied. 7 years dead, mused Scrooge. "Traveling all the time?" "The whole time," said the ghost. "Rest, no peace, innocence, torture, remorse me." "You travel fast," said Scrooge. "On the wings of the wind," replied the ghost. "You might not have ever gotten great quantity of ground in 7 years," said Scrooge. The ghost, on hearing this, sat up and clanked his chain hideously in the dead silence of the night, and the word that would have justified indicting it for nuisance. "Oh, captive, bound in terrible iron," cried the phantom. "Not now, the ages of an instant labor of immortal creatures. This earth must pass into eternity before good, in which is insusceptible and all developed. Not to know the Christian spirit were kindly a little spirit." I am so sorry.